Hey everybody, this is Perch. I talked in this video a bit ago about kind of Jennifer Walters' She-Hulk and John Byrne and kind of this misunderstanding that people had that she was that this was somehow a kind of a sexist exploitation comic, when in reality it was very much a break the fourth wall type comic, and usually with a lot of self-deprecating humor. And don't get me wrong, Byrne definitely drew She-Hulk as shapely and would put her in lots of cheesecake kind of situations. I'm not saying he didn't. It's always, I hate these extreme arguments where I'll get somebody who's like, you think Byrne would have done the same comic if She-Hulk was fat? It's like, I no, probably not, because nothing was selling like that back then. They wouldn't have got that title greenlit, and on top of that, it wasn't the care. I mean, it's a weird argument to me. I mean, I don't even know where to begin with that. But somebody wrote in and said, "Hey, can you tackle kind of the opposite end of this, which are the comics that were exploitive, that did lean into kind of, super kind of cheesecake type stuff? Can you talk about that?" And it's a good topic, because just like She-Hulk is kind of misunderstood, there was a run of comics that kind of hit Marvel a little bit more than DC. By the way, I'm just a stickler for kind of trying to be accurate. And I mean trying to be accurate. Don't have to be fully accurate. Don't have to be, this isn't gatekeeping. You don't have to know every bit of history before you can talk about it. You try and do the best you can. And when new information presents itself, you go and you explore that. And maybe you change your mind and you update your thinking. That's how regular normie human beings work anyway. But it's funny to me that people will often point to kind of the sexist excesses of the 90s, and they've got the decade more or less right, but they point to that, and they for whatever reason, the poster child of it is Power Girl. And I find that weird, because I don't think Power Girl is the best example of this. Power Girl does have the quote unquote boob window costume, and that's fine. But at the time, you had much more ludicrous things going on. For me, the highlight of all of it, and it was one of those cases where fans disliked it almost to a T. There were a few that were into it, but very much the majority hated it. And that was Sue Storm, when she adopted a thong plus the four was cut out, and she looked absurd. And they later kind of changed the storyline a bit, or I don't know about change the storyline, but they basically ran a storyline where she was being controlled by, it's kind of a malice return, and just a couple areas where she was, there's a reason why she was suddenly dressing like a whore, and that's what you got. So at the time, by the way, Reed Richards had a weird, like a vest on. I think the Thing was running around with a helmet. I mean, there's all kinds of weird things about that era. But during that time period, a lot of Marvel characters went for the boots plus thong plus some kind of bra element to the clothing, and it was absurd. The fans were not as into it as people think. I think some people look back on it and go, they knew how to draw women back then, but they really didn't, because by and large, most of these renditions of women were not super, like they weren't the most attractive view of things. They tended to have a very carbon copy, almost extreme studios kind of look to them. That's not a knock at Rob Liefeld, by the way. A lot of people were aping his style at that point. And you had just this, you had just kind of very silly things, from the Avengers to the Fantastic Four. Certainly some of the X-Men. There was a brief storyline when the X-Men went through the Siege Perilous in Australia, and they were kind of rebooted. This is where you got Psylocke turned into a ninja with a thong kind of bathing suit of a costume, and Jim Lee made it work. It's still. I mean, was it cheesecake? Absolutely. Was it sexualized? Sure. But the people who came and cloned it were far sillier. There was a storyline where Forge and a number of the X-Men, Moira, were leading this kind of X team off Muir Island, and the like Polaris and Moira herself were suddenly running around like a thong. It was absurd. And where it became absurd, and I think tipped the whole thing over, was when you had characters like Sue Storm or like Moira, where they didn't fit those costumes. You don't shove everyone in something like that. It doesn't. It just comes off as absurd. You have plenty of characters where that could work, but you get very quickly into this. It's like the uncanny valley territory of just the costume just looks ridiculous, and there were a lot of examples of that. This was kind of the mid '90s, I would say, where this was really kind of at its zenith. Again, it's one thing to kind of look back at some of those covers and go, "Oh man, look at this! Got a sexy looking lady on the cover here." That's not. But then when you actually read those things month in, month out, they just look ludicrous, and they often did. Is the thing. So I think that Power Girl is it's unfair that she gets targeted for a lot of this stuff because I mean of all things considered, her costume's kind of the least silly of many of these. It's many. Marvel was really hard up on this. No pun intended. The stuff out of Image, there was a time period where that was going, but it was just a lot of very not the best art. People who were, I think, trying to mimic Rob Liefeld and doing it poorly, or a little bit Jim Lee and just doing it poorly, and then just a lot of very bizarre poses. Of course, Rob Liefeld himself did have that image of the Enchantress in his rebooted Avengers comic when they did, Heroes Reborn, where she's like her legs are like 12 feet tall and then her body's kind of up there. I mean, there is definitely some silly stuff, and you know, but the funny part again is that the comic buying audience was not just super excited, horny about these comics. They were reading them, but in many cases it was almost embarrassing. In a lot of cases, there would be I had customers who were coming in who were like, I mean, it just seemed silly more than anything else. Now I'm sure there'd be, by the way, some of you in the comments were like, no, always thought it was great, but if you were there at the time buying these comics, you didn't feel good picking up that boob window Sue Storm comic. It just like that, no part of that seemed like something that was going to be a good decision on anybody's part. Eventually, I think somebody kind of woke up and realized that they'd gone too far. That you got some one sexy lady on the team goes a long way. You don't need to convert everybody there, and maybe if you're going to have a scene where Rogue is in the Savage Land and her costume's all ripped up, and you're seeing a lot of skin, that can be appealing to the readers. But if you dress every character like that for every issue, it starts to be silly at that point. I think this is my personal point of view on this more than anything, but I think that comics have a problem where you want to tease, maybe you want to have some sexual elements to the comic, but you gotta in moderation, because if you do too much of it, you get caught between not being explicit enough as just porn, which people who are super into that are just they're gonna bypass the middleman of comics and just go to porn. Nobody's gonna pick up like a copy of the X-Men as kind of an alternative to Playboy. That just you just balance. The world is about balance. But I don't know. Maybe I have it all wrong. Maybe people right now are listening to this, shaking their heads, going, "No, that was the best time." There's a lot of reasons, by the way, that people like the '90s. This is kind of the cap to this whole thing, is that fans of the '90s, people who say they enjoy the '90s, often get harassed by people who assume that they're talking about, anatomically absurd Steve Rogers or, weird, super thong superheroes. But in a lot of cases, the '90s produced a lot of new comics. It was definitely a shift where the art was very important. And as much as there were a lot of clones out there was also some very good art. You had a lot of kind of bombastic action, which I think is more of what people are appealed to. It's probably a video topic in itself. Why do people love the '90s? I don't think, Sue Storm's boobs were probably on the list for anything. But I have now said the word boobs way too many times in a video, so I will be demonetized, and that's a problem. But it's a time period, folks. That's where things are at. Anyway, let me know in your comments below if this was an era that you particularly loved, or what you thought of that. If you remember the kind of this excess to absurdity, which is No, they don't all need to be dressed up like nuns, but you can take it too far, and Marvel often found a way to. Like and subscribe if you don't mind. Otherwise, follow me. I've got the podcasts up. You can hear lots of shows up there on iTunes or Pandora or Spotify or Google Play or whatever it happens to be. Go check those out, and thanks for listening.